like to introduce to you our next guest speaker. This is his bio.
You don't have to read my bio.
Well, we'd like to introduce him.
It's a,
You sure?
yeah, it's too long.
It's not that long.
Yeah, I'll do the highlights on that. I'll save you the mic time. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. I wish you all peace. Respected sisters, brothers, scholars, leaders, friends. Thank you all for being here today and for having me here as well. Since it's just the bio stuff gets awkward. I don't know. I just feel like it makes me nervous. You know, it's bad enough coming on after Brother Ali abdul-karim, where he set such a huge mission and sets the bar so high. Jazakallah khair for that. And so I don't want to make it any worse. That's right. That's right. And that's exactly it. You know, the fact that we are one community. That's exactly where I wanted to start, because it's a thought that really stuck with me, and really I think informs our work when we talk about Islamic activism or any type of activism, community activism, whatever it is. When we think about community, you know, it's really powerful, that difference between Ummah and Jama'ah. You know, that difference between community and what you might be able to simplify to a gathering. You know, what changes us from being a group of people in the same room to a community that actually cares about one another. And so there's a saying of our fourth caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib, that always stays on my mind, where he says that every man, or every human being, is either your brother in faith or your brother in humanity. And that always, you know, really struck me, because I feel like many of us, we want many of the same things, and we approach it from many different angles. And so I appreciated what Brother Ali was talking about, especially because there's two lenses, really. You know, I think that when we talk about our understanding and our outlook, you know, one is, I think, our understanding of religion, and the other is our understanding of history, that deeply affect and guide how we approach our present and our future. And so I think as far as our faith, Brother Ali handled that amply. There's a couple concepts I wanted to just mention briefly and then carry right on. Also, as far as, you know, our schedule goes, I know we're on Muslim Standard Time today, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks as brief as possible so we have more time for question and answer. We'll see how that goes, because we have a very large mission today. So inshallah, actually, would you guys give me like a 5-minute marker when okay. I'm just going to wing it until we get there, so just so you got to cut me off. The one concept, you know, that came to mind is that concept of Iman. And we talk about Islam a lot, but we forget sometimes to talk about Iman and what's the difference. You know, Iman, this is why it's so important to know our Arabic as well, as a reminder to myself, because my Arabic is horrendous. I'm half Iranian, so we don't even touch that Arabic stuff until you get into your faith. Now, Iman, though, is so important because often we translate it as faith, belief, something like that. And it has something of especially in the English, I think it has a very passive connotation. That this idea that faith or belief is something that you just take as a given. You acknowledge something to be true. Sometimes in the hate mail that I receive at Care New York, we'll have things that say, you know, accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and you're fine. You know, you'll be taken from the hellfire. And I always respond, you know, I say, we love us our Jesus. You know, I love Jesus, Islam, but you know, our Lord is one. But at the same time, you know, it's an interesting concept that we need to think about as Muslims, though, too. You know, do we take for granted that to know something is enough versus acting on it? And that's what Iman, I think, is about, the difference between Islam and Iman. You know, you can be a Muslim and you can be a hypocrite, but to be a believer is something certain. And so, when we think about Iman, that's just one thing I'd like to keep in mind when we talk about striving higher. If you know something, you need to act on it. You don't get credit for what you don't do. If you know, in fact, if you know something and you don't do it, it's worse for you than if you didn't know at all. And so sometimes I think even Muslims, you know, we get a sense of an ego. We talk about, well, I'm Muslim, so alhamdulillah, you know, I'm good, I'm safe. You know, no, that's not how it works. The standard is very high. And now one thing, you know, this lecture today is not about, you know, our personal acts of worship as much as it is, well, it's all connected. but especially being tasked to talk about activism and community work and unity and leadership, where the subjects in the title, I think it's relevant as well. If Islam gives us a sense of ethics, if it gives us a system of morals, a standard of behavior, both between each other as well as in a society, then we need to act on that as well. You know, we talk about sabr, you know, very often there's another translation trick. Very often, you know, sabr, sometimes we hear it being translated as patience, right? Patience is a very common translation for it. But I noticed in some of the translations, especially depending on the context, it has also the context of being steadfast. Steadfast. And there's a difference between being steadfast through something and being patient through something. I don't think it's just a semantic definition either, because it's a semantic difference. Because in some way, telling someone to be patient through something, through oppression or through a hard time, is to almost pacify them. Whereas to be steadfast through something is to have some courage and to stand up to it and to be tough and to hold strong in your convictions through a difficult time. And now just to close on this idea that we have a responsibility, there's a hadith that I always keep in mind, because sometimes, to shortcut my own bio, I work at the New York chapter of CARE. It's the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's a civil rights advocacy organization. And it's interesting sometimes to hear pushback from even our own community members and our community leaders who feel that, you know, maybe we should just wait it out, you know, that we shouldn't be outspoken for our civil rights, you know, that, oh, things will change one day, inshallah. You know, it's okay to spy on me, I have nothing to hide, you know, this type of rhetoric. It's very dangerous. And I remind them and I remind myself as well. Sometimes we feel like, you know, we're tough. You may be the victim of a crime, of a hate crime, someone might just say something to you and you just brush it off. But there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that always sticks with me, where he told his companions that it's your responsibility to help both the oppressed and the oppressor. And his companions, may Allah be pleased with them, responded to him ﷺ, asked, yes, Ya Rasulullah, it's right to help the oppressed, but how do you help the oppressor? And he responded by saying, by stopping him from oppressing. I think that needs to be very central to our understanding of our role here in this country, in the West more broadly, and in the world. You know, the rights that the powerful have over us is not just obedience, and in fact, obedience is not included if obedience requires violating our own rights or those of others. Rather, their right over us is that we have the responsibility to help them and to call to what's good. Let me transition on that note. I mentioned oppression, and that's a word that seems like it's a big word, not in meaning, but in gravity. It's not a word that a lot of people like using. And I certainly don't use oppression and discuss oppression or power more broadly as a way to point the finger elsewhere. I'm not casting off the responsibility. In fact, if we learn anything, I hope, from the concepts we just discussed, it only shows us how important these, our responsibility really is. But we also need to, it's like in drug rehab or something. You have to acknowledge you have a problem first. That's the first step, is you have to know you have a problem before you can fight it. And I think we really have sometimes a trouble of understanding of our own history. A lot of the work that we're doing now has been situated within these last 10 years as somehow opposed to what has been euphemistically called the war on terror. The war abroad, which began, well, I would argue that it didn't begin with 9/11. I think it's important that we even watch ourselves and how we message around these things. Government repression is not a post-9/11 phenomenon. And Islamophobia is not a post-9/11 phenomenon. And xenophobia is not a post-9/11 phenomenon. And sometimes we refer to it as such, we essentialize it as a post-9/11 thing, and it almost gives it the sense that it's justified. in a way, as if it's a logical response to a cause. We need to be conscious about how we, even ourselves, we think about these things. When we talk about when we even talk about it as national security issues, when we talk about civil rights violations in the context of national security, as if they're somehow opposed to them, we're undercutting our own argument. We're validating really the whole premise that all of this oppression is based on. It's not the first time in our history that fear is used to justify war. In fact, I would argue that it always is. But when we look at surveillance, when we look at the many other practices, government practices that have somehow become legal in the last, or at least normal, if not legal, in the last 10 years, more of them under Obama than under Bush, I'm sorry to say. When we talk about these things, it becomes very clear that they flout all understanding or respect for human rights or human dignity. And even if you want to have the conversation, and it would be a much longer conversation, but even if you want to have the conversation about this utilitarian approach to law enforcement, as if, our security, quote unquote, is more valuable than human rights, is more valuable than human dignity, which personally I reject, but we see this is a very common media narrative now. Even if you want to have that conversation, all real experts on the subject have very clearly, even the police department themselves have acknowledged that their mass surveillance has produced no leads. Even the top military brass have admitted that these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were failures. Actually, there we go again, talking about war in the past tense. We show how they've gotten in our heads. We've already forgotten that these wars are still ongoing. I caught myself. If I do that again, you're allowed to yell at me. We're here for each other. This is really important, though. And it's really clear, that, this is the language of war, and the militarism in our society has forced us to blindly support a lot of these things, to support this narrative, to wrap ourselves in the flag, to position ourselves as patriotic Americans that support our troops. Amazing. Amazing that we fall victim to this as well. How many Muslims do you see in the media that feel obligated to say, as if to defend us, to say, but we have this many hundred Muslim police officers in the NYPD. We have this many thousand soldiers defending our country, as if that's what they really got sent to do. They've really gotten in our heads, and it's important that we think about this in the context of war, because Islamophobia, and it's crucial that we understand, Islamophobia is the propaganda of the imperial project. I'll say that again. Islamophobia today is the propaganda of the imperial project. People are not Islamophobic, or let me say that people are not bigots, and people are not opposed to Muslims in our government institutions because they don't understand us. Let me clear that out right now. Trust me, they have enough Muslim advisors. If you think that by joining the FBI you're going to turn around the national security project, it's just not true. This has always been, and as long as we have access to history, this has been a feature of it. And it's important that we understand these things, because part of the imperial project is not just colonizing land, but colonizing minds. And that's what I meant to say when I talk about how our understanding of history and our awareness and our lens of history affects our present and our future and how we approach them. Because part of the colonizing minds is I think the military aspect is one, and I jumped the gun on that. Identifying with the state, though, more broadly, is the real issue. How do we identify ourselves with the state? Do we identify ourselves as servants of the state, or do we realize that state institutions are public servants that we pay? Do we approach history as if we are the victims of history and that we are just on a determined track that has been determined by policymakers? Or do we realize that we are subjects of history and that we are actors in history and that we are changing history as we go, of course, by the will of Allah? It's really important that and that's why I started with the religious concepts that I did in that little translation exercise, because very often our own faith is used against us as a way to pacify instead of to mobilize. And part of that is the colonized mind. Now, the colonized mindset I think we see in many other ways. outside of the realm of politics or outside of the realm of activism, we see how classism has been used against us. The caste systems from our countries that our ancestors came from are still used against us to divide. Tribalism. Talked about, thank you for mentioning that, brother, about the red not being better than the black or the black not over the white. This is crucial to understand because tribalism is still so relevant in our lives. Of all the social ills that Islam came to remove, the fact that we are still so tribal has divided us so much. And it's not just, I mean, sectarianism is one. You know, when your mother tells you you can't marry someone from another country, that's tribalism. It is. I'm sorry. It is. You know, when we think that we're better than someone else, we think that we know our knowledge of Islam is better than someone else's because of what languages we speak. That's tribalism. When we judge one another, we say, you know, those people from that country, they're not even Muslims. Because of the admittedly few stories that we may see about them. That's tribalism. And this division, you know, talking about the end times, I don't know what plays into it more tellingly, what more invasively than that. And so, part of our understanding of history, though, has to find that balance, right? Where we have a rhetoric that many of us have adopted. The post-9/11 Muslim narrative was that we're just trying to fit in, we're peaceful, we're here to help. We're not doing anything too crazy, we're just doctors and, you know, your cab drivers and, you know, public servants. We're not here to shake anything up. We apologize when necessary. On all the relevant anniversaries of 9/11, we'll have a press conference. And think that we're distancing ourselves from something that we didn't do, whereas only one more time the American media watching audience has a chance to see 9/11 and Muslims in the same headline one more time. We have to really think about how our understanding of history is doing damage to our potentials for the future. Because while we have a rhetoric, and I see this a lot, even some folks that within my own organization, I care, I admit, this idea that, well, this country was founded on religious freedom. This country was founded on social justice. It sounds cute. The country was founded on slavery, and it was founded on economic battles. Slight differences in philosophy. And I'm not dismissing the value of ideals. I'm not, you know, because that's why we're here. And I think that, you know, even if the U.S. Constitution as is, especially the Bill of Rights, were honored as is, we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we have today, I must say. When we think about freedom of speech, freedom of religion. If practiced, that's a really beautiful thing. That's a critical concept. I'm not dismissing that at all. That's why many of us are still here, even when it seems bad. But at the same time, we need to realize that we've never accomplished, we've never achieved those ideals, and that we have so much further to go. We didn't end war, we didn't end oppression, we exported it. We didn't end violence in this country, we sent it overseas. Or at least we sent it across the street. And we have so little solidarity with one another. We have so little solidarity with one another that we see someone, perhaps of another faith, perhaps of another color, being stopped and frisked and searched by the police illegally, and we think it doesn't apply to us. Or we see the MSA at another school being surveilled, the MSA being infiltrated, their students being entrapped, and we think it doesn't apply to us. And we see wars on the TV, if it's even on TV. Our sisters and brothers being killed. Sometimes by our own government. In fact, most of the time. And we think it doesn't apply to us, or that it's out of our reach. And this is where our understanding plays into our reality. When I'm talking about mindset, it may seem trivial when we have so much work to do. But we need to have a good understanding before we can approach that work in a disciplined manner and an effective manner. So that's all the time I wanted to spend on that. Inshallah, I'm going to try to wrap up soon because I'm much more interested in hearing your own thoughts on the subject. Okay, thanks. Because I don't mean to you know, we're not here about just giving the bad news and then bouncing on you. You know, this is, I'd like to leave you with a few things, a little bit of hope. And that's why we're doing this work. You know, there has to be some hope, right? As I'm still standing here. We haven't built the bunker and gone into hibernation. Not yet. Maybe after this election, we'll see. But at the same time, you know, I do have the hope that things will change. Because one of those understandings that we talk about, you know, one of those understandings that that we need to talk about is that difference, for example, between legality and morality. But that understanding of history comes with it. How are we going to approach the law that we're living in? And I think most of it's good. Some of it isn't. You know, when we were responding to the NYPD surveillance program, which is spied on most college students, most Muslims in New York City and around the northeastern United States, and even some abroad. That's our local police department that we're paying for. That when responding to that, while we had to develop a legal strategy to see if a court case could force the NYPD to reform itself, we also needed to approach a legislative strategy as well. So we have to have the understanding that there's a very real possibility that the law will not protect us in this case. We need to become politically active, politically conscious, politically aware, politically adept even, to really make the changes that are needed. Remember, this is the country where slavery was legal, where segregation was legal, where the internment of Japanese, internment is such a soft word, it sounds like internship, the imprisonment of Japanese Americans was justified by the Supreme Court. And it took them 50 years to get an apology and reparations. And how many other communities have been victims of oppression, institutionalized oppression, and never received those reparations? That's just a rhetorical question. And so we need to approach this with the possibility that this law can change. We need to see where we have power. How do we build our power? As Muslims and as people of faith more broadly, people of conscience. You know, how do we change the laws where we can? You know, in the city council we may have more power. On the state level government we may have more power. You know, when I tell Muslims to vote, they say, yeah, but Obama and Romney are the same. I'm like, yeah, they are, but there's a lot of other elections at the same time. I'm not endorsing either presidential candidate, I'm endorsing voting. And you have to vote for somebody. Stephen Colbert the other day made a joke about how with his state legislature he just votes for the guy with the craziest name. And I probably did that last time too, I didn't know. But at the same time, you know, those state legislatures that we vote for or don't vote for may be able to make the law to institute oversight over the NYPD. You have people who have understanding of civil rights issues, or at least a respect for them. They might be people who have our community's interests at heart, or they may not. And so we need to be engaged in that way as well. And I think also we need to keep our mind in education. That's what this is about. That's what this gathering is about. And the education is not one way. It's not like we have knowledge that we're going to dump on you. The education is mutual. You know, even in the opportunity to come up here and to, you know, formulate some thoughts, you know, to speak to you about what we're working on. You know, that's a moment of reflection for me to really think and to take a step out of my own head and to see what we're doing and whether it works or whether it doesn't. We need to have humility in what we do. And the education process, if it's done humbly and if it's done in a liberating fashion, it will engage people, it will bring people in. It involves a commitment. You made a conscious choice to be here, I would imagine. Unless Talha made you. You made a conscious choice to be here because maybe you hope that you would benefit in some way. And I hope, inshallah, that we all benefit in some way. And so our education has to have that as well, and our commitment to educating others and our communities has to have that understanding as well. Because I really do believe, I literally just ran from a panel at Teachers College up by Columbia University. I'm glad you guys are running on Muslim Standard Time, because I was as well. And so it was a very interesting question came up. A brother raised his hand, and he asked, and these were all people studying education, you know, in grad school. And he asked a great question. He says, where does it stop? Where does it stop? He said, it looks like when we look at the different chapters throughout history, it looks like the state always won. He was talking about the really like COINTELPRO versus the Panthers, or versus the BLA and other Black Power movements or civil rights movements, in relation to immigrants' rights movements or environmentalist movements. You know, any of these groups, all of them have been the targets of oppression. And he seemed to be of the opinion that the state always won, and to some extent, at least by the scoreboard, that's probably true. Malcolm X, I remember he had a quote that I thought was always powerful. It's like, you can't, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like, you can't stick the knife in 5 inches and pull it out 3 and call that doing me a favor, or something along those lines. But at the same time, we have to, keep our mind on the concrete wins and on concrete goals, more importantly than that. See the potential where it is. It was through activism, through advocacy, that some of the laws that may protect us, or at least provide the framework for protecting us from state repression, were done through advocacy. It was done through those movements. It was pushing back. And yeah, there are a number of people from those movements who are still in prison, who have been left in solitary confinement and forgotten about. But there are many people who are now free because of the advocacy of that time, and every life is valuable. And I think that there has to be, the way that we approach the question with the brother is I understood where he was coming from, but I hope that there's a breaking point. Because the legal efforts, the legislative efforts, these are attempts at reform. These are working within the system for reform. To reform a system that's in place, maybe not changing it too radically. We're trying to reform it, to rein it in the powers that it already has, and there's obviously a lot to that. Passing the law doesn't fix the problem, there's follow-up. But I think if it doesn't work, then I hope that we can trust in each other to have that point where we wake up. We've been dealing with this for some time, for some decades, well, arguably centuries, but on the other side of the world, our sisters and brothers rose up recently, throwing off dictators where the difference in power was much worse. At least we can think so. It seems like it was much worse than what we're dealing with now. They had no rights. They didn't even have the right to have a gathering like this. And they still had a wide enough and a long enough view of history to know that they could change it and that they should. Because what it is, with this conversation is going to move beyond one of civil rights. It's going to move and then beyond a conversation about human rights. And it's going to have to become a conversation about human dignity. And that's what we're all here for. That's the goal of our Sharia, of our way, is for human dignity. That's all. Anything that you can do to validate someone else's dignity, to support someone else's dignity, to give yourself dignity. SubhanAllah, been to Morocco and to Pakistan and to look at Muslim communities throughout the West even. We don't have much dignity. We don't walk around with dignity. We don't walk around with strength. And it's going to be on us, all of us, to do our small part, to contribute back to that. So I'm just going to leave, then I'm going to finish it on 5 points, literally bullet points. It's because all of us here, we're all going to go in different directions. We're going to leave this room, we're going to go into different careers, we're going to follow different paths in life. Some of us will stay maybe devoted to this work in different ways. Some of us will go on to other careers. And I wish everyone all the best in that. And I pray, I offer my most sincere dua that all of us and all of you in this audience have beautiful and blessed lives and safe. That you're never touched by these things that we see happening to so many other people. I really do hope for that. We're not here to fearmonger, to inflame. We're just here to educate ourselves and to protect ourselves. And to create change, a substantive and systematic and just change, not just for us, but for all people. And so, there are a few things that I like to leave with you guys as students or as young professionals or as young people of faith. Number one is to know what you want. What do you want? I try to do this exercise about once a month. I ask, what do you want? What do you want to change? Or even if you don't want to change, you better want something to change. But even if you don't want to make something change, what do you want? Because only if you know the goal will you be able to find the straight path, the most efficient and the most effective way to get there. If you think the system is messed up, and it is, what would your ideal system be? If you think laws are wrong, then what would the right laws be? Try to wrap your head around that. I only did that recently, and kind of a therapeutic exercise. Think about where you'd like to see the world first.